Hello, Stefan. Thank you so much for being here with Jungian Institute podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Could you please begin with maybe introducing yourself? Who are you? What do you do?
You want my full name?
Yes.
So my name is Stefan Julich. Some people pronounce it Julich. I pronounce it Julich. I'm currently core faculty with the East-West Psychology program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I've been core faculty for 2 years, but I've been affiliated with the school since 2006. I came to actually complete my PhD at in, at the school in our department in East-West psychology, and somehow got lost in the labyrinth and have never left.
Great. And you mentioned before to me you have a background in Zen, and that was your initial spiritual practice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I was thinking about this after our conversation, and I am not initiated. I I never stayed with one sangha long enough or one teacher long enough, but I decided to type up just so that I could. And I have even missed something in my list that I'll try and fit it in somewhere. Um, the the influence that Zen has had on me has been pronounced throughout my entire life. But as I said, I've never stayed in one place very long, and there's a story that's involved in that, and maybe we'll get to that later. But it began when I was maybe 16 or 17. So this is in the 1970s. I'm 66 now. And there was a radio station for anybody who's my age and who comes from New York and would remember WNEW, which was an FM station. There was a disc jockey named Vin Scelsa who Sunday mornings would, an hour before his radio program would come on, they would play audio recordings. They were from two different traditions. The one that I remember, though, was Alan Watts, Alan Watts recordings. So little did I know that those recordings, the bulk of those recordings were actually made in Berkeley at KPFA radio station or on I think he had a houseboat in Sausalito. And it was under when he was working for or through the American Institute of Asian Studies, which later became the California Institute of Integral Studies. When I finally made it to CIIS, somebody pointed me to this little room that was off of our main hall, which is called Namaste. And we had his library of books in there. He was actually even the dean or the director of the school for a little while. So I was listening to Alan Watts back in the 1970s, long before I came to the school. And he was talking about Taoism and Zen. And I was fascinated with his talks on both Taoism and Zen. A friend of mine gave me a book on Buddhism that they couldn't connect with, and I read the book and I was fascinated with it. Alan Watts had suggested, I guess, or he had named D.T. Suzuki in one of his talks, who was a scholar, not really considered to be a practitioner. I don't know whether he was actually in a lineage or anything, but he wrote extensively and quite beautifully, and with a lot of feeling about Zen. And I decided that I would go learn how to meditate and found just, I think, looked up in the yellow pages to see if there was a Zen, a temple or a Zendo in my area. And I grew up on Long Island, and there was a Zendo in New York City called the Zen Studies Society. And that was under the auspice of Edo Shimano Roshi. And you forgive me, I can't remember his lineage. And so I went and I attended, I don't know, maybe 6 months or something like that. And regularly once a week I would go and then I would sit at home. And I actually fell in love with him. I really loved him. I know that later on there were issues and he was brought back to Japan for bad behavior, maybe, but I learned a tremendous amount just from being in his company, just from observing him and the way that he comported himself. And the Zendo was quite lovely. It was my first exposure to that aesthetic, to the Japanese aesthetic, and I was really enthralled by it, which was probably the exact wrong thing that one should be when one is practicing Zen. But I think that that was the hook. He used to say, meditation is something that we do while the real work is being done, kind of behind the scenes or beneath the surface. And then I left New York, so I was no longer sitting there, and I found my way to Boulder, Denver, Colorado, excuse me. And there was a Zen community house there. The priest's name was Dharman, and but I don't remember his Anglo name. And this was under Roshi Philip Kapleau. And I stayed there for about a year and also had pretty wonderful experiences there. I really loved the household and I loved Dharman very much. Um, it was during that time that I actually moved to Boulder and started attending classes at the Naropa Institute. This was back in 1980. So Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was still alive, um, as was Allen Ginsberg. They were the co-founders of Naropa Institute. So I got to sit in the presence of both of them during that time. Uh, and I was reading texts like Huang Po, the Zen teaching of Huang Po, translated by John Blofeld, um, the Sutra of Huineng, and the Diamond Sutra. And I worked at the school. That's what paid for the courses. At the time, they weren't accredited. Uh, and I, working for the school, I got the chance to attend the Christian Buddhist conference. Don't know if it was the first one, but it was one of the early ones, which was really sweet because actually the year that I attended, Edo Roshi didn't come, but he came the next year, and I went to listen to him talk, which was lovely. But I attended the Christian Buddhist conference, um, and it was actually during this time, two things happened. First was uh, I had this tremendous, I don't know, there was this feeling of tremendous pride and even a derision, if I can use that word. It's a very strong word to use, but among the practitioners of either Eastern traditions or who studied under gurus, or even from within the Zen community, that I found very disturbing. And the Christians who were there, by and large, Father Thomas Keating was there, Mother Teresa Bielecki, Brother David Standelrest. There were a few others. They seemed to me very humble. There was a tremendous amount of humility that they brought, and it was sincere. I had a private conversation with Father Keating, and I left that conversation feeling like I wanted to explore Christian mysticism. And I actually stepped away from Buddhism for quite a while because of this experience that I had. Also, I was sitting up in the Flatirons one evening and I was reading I was reading the Diamond Sutra. It was the Diamond Sutra, and I think I can't remember. It was chapter 21 or something like that, where Buddha says uh, very specifically about an object like a table. He said we call it a table. That's a conventional word, but it's not a table. And I thought to myself, the thought occurred to me, we call it Buddhism, but it's not Buddhism. That's just a word. Those two things combined somehow just made me walk away from the tradition. I I came to New York and I was studying the works of Rudolf Steiner. Darman warned me. He said, if I told him I was interested in Christian esotericism, he said, that's a tiger chasing its tail. And he was absolutely right. But if you enjoy running in circles, it can be really a lovely way to spend your time. So I studied Steiner, and he had very decided ideas about Buddha and Buddhism, which for a long time, for 20 years while I was studying Steiner, I was trying to understand within that context. And after a while, I realized he is appropriating in a way Buddhism away from the core teachings and not if you bring up these Steiner's teachings to a Buddhist, to a practitioner, they're going to disagree with you. And Steiner's way of working with this was to say these teachings are old and they're no longer germane today. Consciousness has evolved. And it took me a while to realize that there's a problem with that approach, because if consciousness has evolved, that means that Buddhists have evolved. And if we're talking to Buddhists who are working within the tradition today, they're not working with a dead tradition. The tradition is very much alive. So then I started reading Jung. I actually, after a while, realized that Steiner's ideas, as beautiful as they were, I wasn't learning from them. All I was doing was learning how to memorize those ideas. So I began to study Jungian psychology. Jung had a very different approach to the East, to Buddhism and to Zen, and he wrote a little bit on Zen Buddhism. He was always looking for a way to make a bridge to his own experience as a Christian, as somebody who was raised within a Christian milieu. I don't think he considered himself Christian in a traditional sense. So for 10 years, he was studying Eastern traditions, and I was learning my Eastern traditions now from Jung. At the same time, living in New York City, there was a Chan teacher who was on public access cable in New York City who used to teach. They used to air his, I can't remember his name, very traditional and very conservative in a way. But uh, his program would go on at like 2 o'clock in the morning overnight, Friday to Saturday. And I would stay up every night just to watch. So week after week after week, and they were beautiful. His teachings were more ethical. They weren't mystical in any way, and he wasn't dealing with koans. It was really a way of using Chan Buddhism as a core ethical approach to life, which was something that I felt it's important.
Yeah.
Um, I left New York. Was living in Manhattan. I left New York a little bit after 9/11. I was there when 9/11 happened. And many things happened to me. I had my best friend, had a very, very good friend. One of my two best male friends committed suicide. My father died. My daughter graduated school. I was working at her Waldorf school as the chef. And it seemed like this is an ending for me. So I drove west and actually south first to Boca Raton, and which is where my mother was. And I stayed a few months with her, and I was sitting in a makeshift zendo in a Unitarian church, which was under the auspice of Tenshin Roshi, who was at Zen Mountains Center. He was a student of Maizumi Roshi in the White Plum lineage. And I had an extraordinary opening experience with, if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it, but I don't know that it's germane. And the lay priest or the lay teacher who was guiding the meditation said, "I'm going to send you to my teacher." So I traveled across the country and went for an ango, for a training in Zen Mountain Center. And I didn't make it through the entire training. And I was thinking that I would stay there. I really wanted to stay in a monastery, in a monastic situation, and thought I had a vocation at one time. And I had trouble getting along with Tenshin Roshi. At the time, he wasn't a Roshi. I think he was just considered the abbot of the monastery. And I had not agreed to be a student. And I found him to be very martial in his approach. And this is to say nothing about him individually as a person or as a teacher. It just was very difficult for me. So I wound up leaving the community and wandered up from there to CIIS. And once I came into the school, I realized that this is where I needed to be. So at CIIS, there was a teacher named Yi Wu, Dr. Wu, who taught classes on Zen and Taoism. And I took one class with him, read some of his books, his translations. But mostly I studied with Stephen Goodman, who was a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. also embodied kind of beginner's mind, which I understand we're going to talk about, in a really, really wonderful way. And I just felt a very profound, deep, loving connection to Stephen. So I attended many of his classes over the time that I was studying at the school, but never returned to my practice, never returned to Zen until a few years ago, through my chair, who was the chair of my dissertation. His name was Brendan Collins. And Brendan, at one point, I think for 12 years, he was a Benedictine monk, and then studied psych. His spiritual leader, his teacher or guide, or maybe the abbot of his monastery, told him to go study psychology, if I'm getting this correct. And he went out and studied psychology, and then took a job at CIS in the Integral Counseling Psychology program, and then finally in East West. And his partner, I don't know if they're married, but his partner's name is Gail Sher, Sher, who was a student under Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. And she is a lay practitioner, but she was given permission. She took her initiation and she was given permission to teach. And so I spent a year with her, um, listening to her teachings and actually having a weekly conversation with her, which was really extraordinary. Oh, and one thing that I left out was that while I was living in New York City, I attended a seminary called the New Seminary for Interfaith Ministers. And there was a Buddhist nun who was affiliated with the school, who came and did a lay initiation with us. And I took uh, the Bodhisattva vow. And I've taken two vows in my life that I hold as sacrosanct. And one of them was the Bodhisattva vow. And I am woefully underqualified to be anything like a Bodhisattva. And sometimes I wonder what I got myself into. But I have never forgotten taking the vow and how essential it's been in my life. Of course, I have to kind of heal myself of my own ignorance before I can help others. But I consider that to have been a seminal moment in my life. And
Mm.
then I met you, which is wonderful. And I've also taught a tiny bit in the ACTS program, the Asian Contemplative and Transcultural Studies program at CIS. I taught a course on mysticism, it was the advanced seminar, the MA advanced seminar. And I've grown fairly close to Jun Wang and have many conversations with her also, and she teaches classes on Zen. So
Mm.
you can see there's a lot of connection there.
Yeah, it seems like you try to escape Buddhism, but Buddhism keeps saying, "Hey, Stefan, come back, Stefan, come back," and unescapable for you so far.
It's unescapable.
Yeah, and now you're on a podcast here with Jungian Institute, which is the Chan lineage. But as you know, I told you we embrace all traditions,
Mhm.
invite all traditions. So you, goodness, have so much background, Stefan. How do you keep a beginner's mind?
I don't mostly. I I had my dosha checked, I guess. This is a in Ayurvedic medicine, they'll take your pulse, right, and determine what your dosha is. And I have an overactive mind. It never stops. When I was when I was 9 years old, I had this really remarkable experience when I was 9 years old, I think around nine. I was driving back with my family from a relative's house over the Christmas break. And everybody in the car was asleep. My father was driving. He wasn't asleep, I hope. And we came off the highway and pulled into a gas station. And my father assumed I was asleep. I was I think, in the back of the car. And he he didn't say anything. The radio wasn't on. He just turned the engine off. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He unlocked his door. He opened the door. He closed the door. He walked I guess to get the attendant. At that time, attendants would fill the gas in the car. I heard two sets of footsteps coming back. There was a movement in the car as they opened the gas cap, and I could hear the gas coming through. I could hear the ching 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 of the gas, the old style gas machine that used to make noise when it was pouring gas. I didn't hear a sound. I didn't hear a word. I mean, I didn't hear a word spoken. Then after a while, that was done. That was reversed. The cap was put on. My father got back in the car. There was a concussive feeling of the car moving as he sat down, the closing of the door. And it took me a while to realize that all of this happened in complete silence. Complete silence. There were no words. Nothing was spoken, but there was nothing being spoken in my head. There was just the awareness that this was transpiring. And this extraordinary feeling of warmth that I associate with love. I don't know why. I'm not love that has an object, not love as desire, but just this feeling of my heart filling the entirety of my body. And for years after that, I could call that experience up. And I knew nothing of sitting or, Zen. The only thing I knew about Zen when I was a child, like in the 1960s, was cereals were being named after Zen, and hair cutting establishments were being called Zen haircutters and stuff like that. That's all I knew. But this experience was so palpable and it lasted for years. And then my mind started getting really active. I think I decided when I was in my late teens or early 20s that I I didn't have a very strong intellect. I wasn't a good thinker. So I decided I would work on that. And I've spent my whole life working on that. But the older I get, the more I realize that that initial experience, that 9-year-old experience, was it. That was it.
Yeah, that was it. That was your cup was empty. And then it's funny, isn't it? Us humans, we get older and we decide to fill the cup more and more, overflow the cup, that we can't receive teachings. We can't uh, even receive our own insights, our own wisdom. We cannot hear. And that's why, like in Zen, we really emphasize beginner's mind rather than having a full cup. What can we do to empty the cup? Like now, I love your honesty and saying right now it seems hard to practice beginner's mind. So when we really look at that, what can we do in our modern society where information is overflowing, information is everywhere, our mind is always racing, thinking, what can we do from your perspective to empty the cup? What can anybody, any ordinary person do to empty the cup so that it can be filled with wisdom?
Yeah, in some ways I don't know that there's anything that we can do because the doing fills the cup. That's the trick, right? So what Gail used to say, and this comes from Suzuki Roshi's teaching, she would say everything is Buddha nature. There's nothing to accomplish or to gain. That's the trick, if there's a trick, to understand that it's everything. There was a nun in Boca Raton who used to come and sit with us, a Buddhist nun. I don't know which tradition she was in. I think she was from the Tibetan tradition, but I could be wrong. And one day we had a conversation, and I don't know how this came up, but she said to me, our suffering is directly proportional to our inability to accept what is at any given moment. I've never forgotten that. This is years and years and years ago. Um, when I accept what is, to really be in the moment, everything is there. It's not like the cup. We say the cup is empty, but everything is there. And if you put your attention on it, then you realize that whatever it is that you put your attention on, yes, that's there. Can you do that? Can you like observe yourself working or observe yourself observing? Can you achieve a certain degree of distance so that when you're engaged in an activity, you can be completely that activity. It almost requires like a separation first. You have to understand that this that have to understand myself that there's a part of me that is engaged in activities because they help me define who I am. So I'm a teacher, right? So a university professor. That's pretty good, university professor. It feels pretty good. But the moment that I think, Joseph Campbell used to say, "What a good boy I am," I'm that's where I fall. That's where I'm in trouble because I'm living through what Jung would call my persona, and my ego is attached to that. My sense of who I am in the world. So this is it's not so easy because we can forget, and that's wonderful to forget and just be, to just do, and that happens for really long periods during the day. But am I conscious of that? Coming back to myself in a way is like coming out of a dream or a dreamless state. And I have the feeling that what's wanted is to actually be conscious in that experience of no self, to be conscious in that experience of dependent co-arising or of beginner's mind. So what Gail would say is she used Shunryu Suzuki's model. He just took Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And she would say, she said that he said that to understand beginner's mind through the perspective of Buddha is to be oneself fully in each moment. It's a lovely sentiment. It's not so easy. However, we're always ourselves fully in each moment. And, and then we define it. And then we're not, then we're somehow lost. And yet we are, because everything is that. Everything is that. Then Dharma is to practice wholeheartedly with no gaining idea, she says. And that comes from Suzuki Roshi. No, in other words, there's nothing to gain from this. I go get a PhD. My family was wondering why I wanted to get a PhD. I actually had no idea. I just knew that I wanted to do it. But I wasn't approaching it with no gaining idea because there was this idea that I would achieve something. I would get something from it. And of course, once you have it, you realize that it's not it. It's just a word. It's something that you've put your attention to, and that's also an effort, right? And then Sangha, practice in a community with others. And this is the idea that if you surround yourself with people of like mind and like purpose, then it actually helps your practice. It helps keep you focused on the essentials. And being at CIS has been that way for me, to be in the company of people like yourself, or to be, with Debashish or all of the faculty in our program and many of the faculty in the rest of the school, to be engaged in a community with a mission. And that mission to me seems like it's a good mission in the world. And finally, she says that, this is a quote from Suzuki Roshi: "In beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the experts, there are few." So I try is also a difficult word. As Yoda said, there is no try, there's do or not do. Right? I don't, I, maybe because I came to this so late in my life, I actually can't think of myself as an expert. So maybe I'm fortunate in that way. But it also has seemed to me throughout my entire life that if I put my attention to something, I played guitar for 45 years and I was fairly accomplished. I haven't played in 8 years and I can't even remember how to play basic chords. I painted. I studied fine arts painting, and I got fairly adept at drafting, and at painting. I draw circles now because I haven't done that in 8 or 10 years since coming to the school and getting involved in other things. Something about being completely absorbed in the activity fills me. It feels like I'm home. But when I walk away from the activity, it's gone. It's not about building expertise, but my students expect that I actually know the subjects that I'm teaching. So there's this wonderful, let me see if I can find it, this wonderful quote that it's from an alchemical text called Mutus Liber. Pray, read, read, read again, work, and you shall find. And I would say work and you shall be, maybe. Because finding has that flavor of I'm looking for a treasure. I've found it. Now I have it.
So if in this podcast right now we had Carl Jung visit, what would he say to all of this?
Hmm. Well, if I've said anything about Jung, he probably disagree with me. Excuse me. Jung's an interesting case. He There was a student at our school who was a Chan. Uh, I don't know whether he was actually a monk. He lived in a monastery and he had robes. I'm guessing that I can't remember. Um, I think that he was a monk and then he left and he became a teacher later from China. And I made the mistake. It was unfortunate, but during his dissertation defense, we stepped outside during the deliberation, and he did his dissertation on some aspect of Chan and Jung, and he said something to the effect that Jung didn't really understand Buddhism very well, and I told him that I disagreed with that. I said I actually think that he understood it very well, but he was attempting to build a bridge for Western understanding, and I feel like I insulted this person who was a friend of mine and who I cared for very much because this was his day. He was defending his dissertation. But he sent me an email like a couple of years later or something, or a year later, and he said that he was speaking to his teacher about Jung. And his teacher said, Carl Jung understood Chan Buddhism better than most of my students understand it.
Mm.
Jung's experience came from his direct spiritual awakening. And we tiptoe around this because he himself wanted to be seen as a medical person, as a psychiatrist, and as a psychologist, and as an empiricist. But at its root, I think Zen Buddhism is empirical. It's purely empirical. It's not about speculation. It's not about angelic hierarchies. I mean, they're all there. Whatever is there is there. Reality is multifarious, and the mind is extraordinary. As an occultist, actually, Thelemite, a student of Aleister Crowley, whose name is Lon Milo Duquette, said through an avatar he created for a book called The Chicken Kabbalah. Um, of course, it's all in your mind. You just have no idea how large your mind is. If the mind is expanded to the dimensions of the universe, then you realize that there is just this one thing. There's just this one thing. We can call it Buddha mind. So Jung understood that fundamentally. He had that direct experience himself, and he was attempting to understand the experience that he had, which he wrote down in the Red Book and in his Black Books, through a comparative study of the psyche from other cultures. So if you read his writings on Buddhism, on Zen Buddhism, as long as he's not wandering into attempting to take Buddhism and squeeze it into his model that he created for the psyche with ego and shadow and animus. I was having this conversation yesterday with Jun Wang. As long as you don't attempt to squeeze that teaching into this other, squeeze Buddhism into Jung's model, um, then you're okay. Then he understood, but he understood on his own terms. One of the questions you asked was about kind of cross-cultural understanding. Can you see this in different traditions, that beginner's mind in other traditions? And I think it's there. In Kabbalah, there's a story. I'm going to mangle this. So anybody who's maybe listening to this, if you know the story, it's okay. Please correct me. Of a student who came to a teacher, and the teacher just basically, um, I think that the student had been insulted by somebody or attacked by somebody verbally. And the teacher said, "What was your reaction?" And he said, "Well, I forgave them." And the teacher said, "You need to go back and study more." And the understanding is that there was a separation. As long as you experience a separation between you and the other person, you're not getting the point. Even in Kabbalistic teaching in Judaism, Jung talked about Meister Eckhart especially, and quoted him extensively, even in this his chapter on D.T. Suzuki's book on Zen Buddhism that he wrote an introduction to. That Meister Eckhart says the same thing. The teaching is very much aligned with the Buddhist understanding. But Buddhism has its own flavor because it's culturally inflected. It comes from a particular area of the world that has a very deep foundations that have a particular flavor. They have a particular fragrance. And if you, Jung always warned his students not, he would say, don't be a beggar on other people's shores. Those are very strong words, but essentially, don't appropriate a teaching. Don't say, oh, I love this teaching. I'll take the teaching, but I'm going to leave the rest of the culture because I'm not that interested. The teachings grow up within the culture. And if you're going to understand them as teachings themselves, if you want to understand Zen Buddhism, you really have to have some understanding of where it came from, what its roots were. So I had an anthropology professor once tell me when the Spanish came to the Andes, they discovered potatoes there. And the white potato was basically used for paste and medicine and stuff. It really wasn't eaten, but they liked the flavor of it. So they said, "Yeah, we're going to bring that back to Europe with us." And the people of that area said to them, "Okay, you can if you're going to take the potato, that's fine, but you have to take this plant also." And the Spanish were, "We don't have room in our boats for that. We're just taking the potato." And they said, "Well, you have to take that plant also." "Why do we have to take that plant?" "Well, because they're brothers." What does that mean? That's stupid. What does that mean? So they brought the potato back to Europe, and then there was a potato blight because they didn't have the companion plant.
Mm.
So, and I think that this is what Jung was pointing to, that you can't just pull something out of a culture without respecting the container within which it grew.
Yeah, and it seems like that's the modern world nowadays. Everyone takes different traditions, whether it's Buddhism, Taoism, Vedanta, etc. And they just want to take the good stuff that they
Mhm.
think is good stuff, leave the rest behind without a foundation. That's something at CIS I have been emphasizing is the importance of learning the foundation of whatever contemplative practice anyone chooses. Because then I think if we learn the foundation, we understand it well, we have the right view, then we don't have to go running around in circles, chase around hills, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I'm curious, you being a professor at CIS, and this may be the last question we have time for today, you being a professor at CIS, Stefan, um, is there anything that you do actively for your students to not chase their own tails,
Mm.
or anything you can do?
That's a great question. They're all good questions. Okay, let me see. If you place yourself under the guidance of a teacher or a lineage, uh, it's a very rare occurrence that the teacher is going to start you at the goal and work and then just start filling in the gaps. They're going to start you at the beginning. When I had started learning To sit zazen, I was taught how to enter the zendo, step in with your left foot, right? To, excuse me, to sit in just such a position, to be respectful of others, to not run for the cushion that I wanted, that sort of thing, like behavior. Monitor your behavior. And then I was told to count my breaths and practice that for quite a while until it got frustrating for me. And then I was given another technique, and you're brought along like that, one step at a time. There is a method, and the method is flexible, and the method in some ways will be tailored to the student's temperament, but in other ways, this is a time-honored method. It's 2,500 years of experience within the various traditions. And if you believe that the Buddha was just one Buddha among many, then it goes back eternally, infinitely. So in a university setting, to, we teach in a classroom, I may teach a tradition. I teach magic classes on magic and Jungian psychology. And I notice that the students often don't have the background. And then I'll have to back up and I'll have to try and find my way back to the beginning. But I have 15 weeks to do this in, and I have to be judicious with the way that I dole out information. So what I try and do little by little is get the students to focus on the act of scholarship. What does it mean to be in a university? What is the knowledge that you're attempting to gain apart from the knowledge that you pull from wisdom traditions? That's the method. That's the method you use, and the method by which you become a scholar and a scholar practitioner. Otherwise, uh, it's really tempting, or I don't know the right word for it, but it's very easy to slip into a mindset where you take a class, you hear a whole bunch of things, you read a whole bunch of things, you pull a few bits of information out, and then you plug them into your worldview or your sense of who you are. And that's like putting on clothes. It's all on the surface. The real task is, to pray, read again. There was a teacher, his name was Swami Lakshmanju. He's a Kashmir Shaivite teacher in the lineage of Abhinavagupta. He was the last in his lineage. And he said, studying scripture contextualizes direct experience, right? Studying scripture contextualizes direct experience. But genuine and direct experience makes it possible to understand scripture as well, and you need both. So that's one thing that I'm paying attention to. Another thing that I pay attention to, I try anyway, is that every student that comes to me is a unique expression of what is, but they're a unique expression of that. They have a lifetime of experiences. And my job is to meet them where they are, not force them to memorize things that I'm teaching, because there's, as my partner likes to say, there's the river beneath the river, and that's the real teaching. And to understand that since we're in a university, that there is a lineage. The lineage is the lineage of scholars, and where we are scholar practitioners. And I'm not talking about going back to 19th century kind of European standards of materialist or positivist approaches to scholarship, where the scholar is the patriarchal, omniscient voice that knows everything. That's not it. It's this deeper lineage, these deeper lineages that go back in time to a different way of approaching knowledge and wisdom, trying to teach that through through the courses that I teach. And of course, this is good Jungian psychology. A teacher or a teacher can only teach what they know. A healer can only heal as far as they've been healed. So God help my students, but I take them as far as I can, and by that, what I mean is and I've taken this from the Dalai Lama. My religion is loving kindness. And if I can be loving kind to my students, then it seems to me that's about the best that I can do. And to help be there for them so that they can become the um, the scholar practitioner that they would like to become. So I guess I don't know if that makes complete sense. I want to share an anecdote from this is one of my favorite from Stephen Goodman in my experience with Stephen. We were in a class once. I was in a class once with Stephen teaching, and a man came into the classroom from the street. He was somebody who lived on the street, and he was obviously his mind was not his mind was very free, to put it gently. He was not quite there cognitively. And he was very quiet. He was very respectful. And he sat at the back of the classroom. And just before the break, Stephen, which was atypical of him, asked if anybody had any questions. And Stephen was an extraordinary individual. And he told me once that he was never aware of it, but he had the pulse of the room. If I came into the class with anything troubling me, he would wind up talking about it during the class, and I didn't have to say a word. But he asked if anybody had a question, and this person said, "Yes, I have a question." So Stephen said, "Please." And he said, "But I have to come up to the blackboard." So Stephen said, "By all means." He was holding a piece of chalk, and when this man came up, Stephen handed him the chalk. And this person started talking. He was facing the blackboard and he started talking. And for me, it didn't make any sense. It was very difficult to follow what he was saying. It sounded in a way like, and I mean this without any sense of derision, that he was maybe psychotic, but not dangerous in any way. There was something actually quite charming about him. And he was just drawing circles on the board. And he drew maybe 9 circles as he went. And he was talking about planets and he was talking about in, intelligences like coming from the planets. And it was all fascinating, but I didn't understand any of it. And I was just watching, and Stephen picked up another piece of chalk and he walked behind this man and he drew little smiley faces in every single one of the circles. And then when the man finished drawing his circles and Stephen put the last smiley face in, they both put their chalk down in the tray, and Stephen took a step back so that he could see the whole board. And he looked at the board, and Stephen just said to him, "Are you okay?" And the person said yes. And Stephen said, "Wonderful." And the man said, uh, um, "Thank you." And Stephen said, "You're welcome. Thank you for coming." And the man said, "I may come back sometime." And Stephen said, "You're perfectly welcome." And the man just walked out of the classroom. And I just thought, that was mastery to me. He was completely present. He wasn't thinking this person is mentally ill, or he wasn't thinking anything. He was just reacting purely from a very deep well. I don't think it diffused the situation, but it 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 began to glow with an inner light, and everybody in the classroom was just hushed, jaws dropped. It was lovely. So I think in a way, although I don't try and repeat that, because to repeat it is to learn something by rote and it is no longer sincere. That kind of sincerity and humility and presence to me is what I want to be in the classroom for my students. And I can't always maintain that because I'm grumpy sometimes and I'm distracted and my mind is always racing. And if difficult situations come up sometimes, I don't always know how to handle them. But that's the goal, or that's my hope.
And it sounds like that's what you practice for. Yeah.
I think absolutely. I don't see any other reason. Like I said before, as the Dalai Lama said, my religion is loving kindness. Ultimately, it's not about my being enlightened or anybody else. I mean, I would love it if everybody else was enlightened. It would make my life easier, maybe. Maybe, it would be difficult to be among so many people who were enlightened and just to be the one stupid one. But I, I decided a long time ago I gave that up because it no longer made sense to me. What made sense to me was to deepen my experience of being alive and to treat people kindly. Because Lord knows, none of us really knows what the truth is. We can only follow our hearts and our intuitions, I guess, and and keep company with people that we trust.
Yes, and I think that Stefan, you have great influence on your students, and the kindness I have seen you exemplify in your classes really shows this. So I hope that that continues. And
It's,
now the world needs this deep kindness and also the raw authenticity, like you have shared with us today about your process and not claiming to know everything at all, but just being a human being. And may all of us continue to be human beings in the process.
yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stefan, for your time and being with us here on Tune.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you for letting me hold forth. I do a podcast with Jonathan Kay, one of our students, and I try very hard in the podcast to let the other person talk. So this was a novel experience, and I kept thinking as I was talking, I'm talking too much. But so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan.